And first moment of seeing Baba, of course, has been described in the book Avatar, where I had the great privilege and joy of writing. But another incident occurred the next morning that was quite significant for me. I was called to the room that we had prepared for him. It was my first interview with him. And I sat quietly close beside him, looking at him, smiling, saying nothing for a few minutes. And then he said, "What are you thinking?" He said it, of course, through his alphabet board. And I looked at him, and I said, I don't know what I was thinking. And then he smiled and said, "I know what you were thinking yesterday, and what you're thinking now, and what you will think next year." So I said, "Oh, does that mean because you see things whole?" "Yes," he nodded his head. "That's it." And then there was this lovely moment. Oh, there were so many years between. You know, I met him in 40 years ago, 1930. And many, again, that are recorded in the book and many that aren't. But there was just one more, a goodbye, the last time I saw him. And I said, "Well, thank you, Baba, for all the joy and all the pain." And he smiled and said, "Thank me only for the pain." And as I thought of it later, I could understand why. Because it is only, I have discovered, that as we are able to endure pain, that we are able to endure it, that we can sustain, ultimately, the great ecstasy of the God experience. Because you see, pain and joy are really just two sides of one coin. And unless we have built up in our consciousness the ability to sustain intensity of feeling, intensity of body, we can in no wise be adequately prepared to sustain the bliss of God. When we were with Baba in a group, he would suddenly throw a cape or shawl over his head, and everything would be silent, and it would be 5 minutes before we would see him moving, and then remove the cape. And later, he told us that whenever he did this, he was off, out of the body, on one of his inner meetings. And so we became quite accustomed to this. Of course, I saw it many times on the trip to Boston when he went in and out at least a dozen times, I sitting alongside of him, and I could actually feel, as it were, the presence that left the car. And then in about 5 minutes, I would feel a slight movement, and then after about another 5 minutes, he would remove the cape or shawl that he had over his head. And after each of these times, he never looked directly into one's eyes, because he explained that the power that would still be in them would be too great for us to see. And then one time later, he said to Garrett Ford, our Hollywood writer friend who had helped us to India, at the far end of the garden, And he said this one was going to be one in which two forms would be seen. And so a little later that evening, I looked out. Garrett had told me only this. And Baba, preceded by the Sikh watchman that we had, went ahead holding a lantern, and Baba and Garrett behind him. And they were gone for quite some time. But the next morning, Garrett told me that when they got to the particular place, Baba walked ahead alone about 20 or 30 feet and stopped. And at that moment, these two great figures seemed to be of light, but very definitely in form, communed with Baba, and Baba's hands were moving in this sort of special inner sign language that he used on these occasions. A very wonderful story that I did not see, but which my dear friend Marina Machabelli witnessed. And as some of you may know, Marina was an Italian, and she had this very distinguished friend, a gentleman, a distinguished statesman in Italy. He was also somewhat of a philosopher who had read and studied practically all from her description of the Western philosophies, Schopenhauer and Kant and a few others. And when this friend heard that Baba was going to be in Italy, he said he would like very, very much to meet him. And Marina arranged for it to happen. So when he came, of course Baba did not speak at all, but Marina was able to speak English. He was also able to speak Italian. Baba did not speak Italian, and the gentleman that he met, of course, did not understand English. So Marina acted as the go-between for them. And so, after the introduction, the man began to talk. And he talked about this philosopher and that philosopher and the next philosopher. And this went on for quite some time. Baba started twirling his alphabet board, as he frequently did, and looked around the room, getting more bored by the minute, and Marina getting more disturbed by the minute, wondering when the man was going to stop talking about his philosophy. And finally, she turned to Baba, and in English, which the man did not comprehend, said, "Oh, Baba, please, this man really is an earnest speaker. He has behaved foolishly in this way, but please do something that will convince him that you know what none of these men have known anything about." And so was this. Baba took his alphabet board and flung it across the room, and then turned to the man, and who was sitting close beside him, and put his fingers on his knees. And with this, the man fell down on his knee in front of Baba and put his hands over his face. Tears were pouring down, and he said, "Oh, Baba, Baba, this is it. This is what I have been seeking all my life." He said, "Let me go with you. Let me give you all that I have, my money. I am a rich man. Let me give it to you. Let me live with you, go with you to India." Baba smiled and shook his head and said, "No, my son. You have been born in the West. You have a work to do in the West. I have given you a glimpse of what the true realization is, the true knowing. Now you share it with your fellow man, your countrymen." Well, I have been asked if I can recall any memories of when Baba's love swept over me. Well, it began at the first meeting when I first looked into his eyes. And of course, as the result of that, for the next few days, I was so completely dissolved in the bliss that poured through me that I had no taste for food. I was not able to walk around the house. And when I looked out the windows, all of the trees were covered with Baba's face. And this continued throughout that first visit. And then when I was in India and would be driving from our ashram at Nasik to Meherabad, where Baba's chief ashram at that time was, 5 miles before reaching Meherabad, I would start to feel his presence, and it would build up with such intensity that before I reached there, I would again be filled with this wonderful bliss of Baba's presence. This is one of the interesting incidents that happened when I was with Baba. Delia and I had been called to India. It was our second visit to India, and we were staying at Meherzad, at the new ashram that had been created. And every evening after our dinner, we had been asked by Baba to go over to the other house, which was the woman's house, the Indian women's house. And when we got there, we were told that Baba wanted us, each of us, to tell a joke. Pardon me. Well, I had never felt very expert at telling jokes or relating things of this kind, and I frankly only had one that I could remember. Delia did beautifully. She was an actress, and she knew how to tell jokes, and she could remember them. Marina did also, and even Elizabeth, I'm sure, did very well. So I had to tell the only joke I knew, and it was this. The Monsignor of a large Catholic church in Hollywood had recently a new servant that had been transported from Ireland was acting as his housekeeper servant. And he'd had quite a problem with her because she, learning the names of the new apparatus that we had to use in this house, the electric refrigerator and the electric cleaner and the electric dishwasher, she became very sort of personal about it. And she would say, my refrigerator and my electric cleaner and my this and that. So the Monsignor got a little weary of hearing the my all the time, and he said, now, you know, Maggie, if you would just, don't be so personal about it. Just say, our refrigerator, when something happens to it, as it does, or our electric cleaner. So not long after that, he invited the bishop to come and have dinner with him. And they were having dinner, and everything seemed to be going along rather well. They heard a terrific shriek coming from the kitchen, which was quite near the quarters where the housekeeper lived. And he suddenly came to the door, and the Monsignor said, well, for goodness sake, Maggie, what is the matter? Oh, she said, a mouse, she said, has just run into our room, into our bedroom. Apologies. So Baba loved the story. He thought it was perfectly lovely. And much to the chagrin of one or two of my sisters who were there with me. And when we departed, returned to our own house, I was taken to task for telling Baba such a story. Well, the next night, when we went back, and again we were asked to tell a funny story, Baba looked at me and he said, another one of your funny stories. And I said, Baba, it's the only one I know. Well, he said, tell it over again. I liked it. So that's the story of the one that Baba especially liked. Baba had told us that whenever, this particular night, when he was staying at our ashram, because he only came to the Nasik ashram, the western ashram, about every week or 10 days. And this particular night, he said, well, if you have any dreams tonight, he said, I would like you to write them down on paper, and tomorrow morning after breakfast, I will be with you, we'll all be together, and would like you to present them to me, and I will read them. So the next morning, we all arrived with the particular dream that we had that night. And he would pick the paper up and read it, and then fold it up, not fold it, but squish it up, and then sort of drop it on the floor. And then in this one particular case, he looked at one of the men of the group and waved his finger and shook his head as if there was something in the dream that needed improvement. And this particular man, we had quite a lot of fun with that day, teasing him about his dream. And he did this. He squished up the dreams after reading them carefully, but never read any of them, of course, out loud. And then he would drop it on the floor. Finally, he read my dream and looked very seriously at it, and then folded it up very carefully and handed it to me and said, this dream must be given to me, it must be handed to me on a particular date in April. If I do not happen to be at this ashram, you must send a special messenger with it to me at Meherabad. I must have it on this date. And so I did. And so I have often, always in fact, every April since, I have anticipated something of great importance that may happen on that date in April. Because Baba had signified to me that it was a dream that contained great meaning for me. On my last trip to southern France, I had the misfortune of contracting double pneumonia and was desperately ill for a day or so. I had the benefit of a very fine English doctor who lived there, and he gave me the only thing that he knew to give to prevent my dying, which was penicillin. I didn't know at the time that I was desperately allergic to penicillin, but I found out very soon thereafter. Because after the pneumonia was healed, I found that the penicillin, the effect of the penicillin had on me was, for me, disastrous. It was worse than damage that could be done to the body, which many people have felt through antibiotics. But for me, it destroyed my consciousness. It destroyed that which was the most essential to me, my consciousness. I could make no contact of any meaningful sort at all in their contact. And with the result that for weeks I would walk the streets of Cannes thinking I was losing my mind, going mad. Well, it abated somewhat, and a few months later, I met Baba again. This was my last visit with him. And he asked how I had been, what had happened, and I told him briefly what I had just related, and how terrible it was because it seemed as if I was losing my normal capacity for inner contact, inner feeling, thinking, being, that it had completely gone. That therefore I was losing my mind. And he looked at me very strongly and yet very dearly, and shook his head. He said, I give you my word, you will never lose your mind, Jean. He said, this is my promise to you. For which I was and am profoundly grateful. There was one experience that came to me before I had the joy of meeting Baba outwardly, but since it ties in with this whole subject of inner experience and inner expansion, and is included, I have included something of this in the opening words of Avatar, which some of you may have read and others may not, because it is now out of print. And the first few lines, to give you a little understanding of why I wrote Avatar, I felt it was necessary to give enough of my own background of experience, inner experience, and comprehension to show that what would be revealed in the book is being written by someone who has some capacity, at least, for understanding what is being written. Though I was not consciously seeking a spiritual master, I was seeking that spiritual fulfillment which had been the passionate longing of my soul for many years, divine velocity, and from within its rotation stars, planets, worlds take form. Light and darkness balanced each other. In the midst of chaos, order was established. Then I felt within my consciousness that of evolving life, so dense in the mineral, delicate in the flower, fierce in the wild animal. I could feel with slender pain the dim awareness, the heavy ferocity of these lower forms of life experience. And I recognized these slower life tremors as constituents of my own soul, with its more complex joys and sorrows. Never again could I deny to any aspect of God's creation its own particular awareness, nor could I exclude any emotion from the symphony of life. It revealed to me of what little moment were my sins, how equally unimportant my virtues. I saw clearly that good and evil are simply manifested aspects of this transitory life, while God, in essence, is beyond all opposites. This tremendous reality was not concerned with my petty world concept of vice and virtue. And then further explanation of it. And finally, the one far-off divine event which the poets of all time have proclaimed was now experienced. In a tidal wave of ecstasy, the final remnant of the lesser self was engulfed in union with the Supreme One. For a timeless moment, I was that one. Individuality was not lost, merely raised to the infinite proportions of a God, endowed with his infinite capacity. Now it is this experience that I have been reading solely for the purpose of the effect, perhaps the help, it might have upon some of the readers. I know that many these days have been, in their eagerness to find something more than merely three-dimensional life, have unthinkingly experimenting with drugs of various kinds. Their interest, their eagerness is understandable. But as Baba himself has related before he withdrew, consciously seeking a spiritual master, I was seeking that spiritual fulfillment which had been the passionate longing of my soul for many years when the Master Meher Baba first came into my outer life. And then I go on after a few lines. But now, with deeper understanding, I have become aware that life is an indivisible whole, and that what we call outer is but the objectification of inner processes. Therefore, the spiritual guide is the visible answer to the soul's inner call. And once during this period, as I sat in the dentist chair inhaling nitrous oxide gas, I lost consciousness for a moment. And in that brief interval, I again recaptured the awareness which transcends three-dimensional existence. And I'm reading this from the book because it's put in a succinct way. Before my inner sight, a cosmic panorama of creation, life, death, and man's ultimate destiny was revealed. The sorrows and problems of my earth life, which had weighed heavily upon my shoulders, slipped easily from me. I was free. The limitations of the finite mind had vanished. By the power of directed will, I soared high into space until I reached a sunlit mountain top. And then, to go beyond just the reading, I could sum it up to say that as I stood in this place of elevation, I looked down and saw that below were humanity whirling around, not knowing very much what their direction was. And only a few here and there would break away from the crowd and make a path up to the mountain. And this continued for some time until finally they all reached this same point of oneness, knowing themselves all one. Baba has said before his withdrawal, there is no reality in the experiences that an individual has taken under these conditions. It only at best may give him some interesting, even beautiful or exciting experience of the astral world, which has no merit for the true seeker of God realization or of truth. And so for this reason, I have spoken of this experience, which was given to me in a dentist chair, nothing that I myself was seeking. And yet, at that time, because the soul was obviously ready to receive the experience that came, that which was received was of a constructive and of a high order and of a kind. Baba himself knows now, as he knew before his withdrawal, I have never ceased to love him and to believe in his great destiny and the monumental work which he has achieved for the benefit of the whole of humanity. I am profoundly aware of the tremendous scope of his work and that its magnitude has never been surpassed. I give to him my undying love, which he at this very moment is receiving. Words I have just given were beautifully confirmed for me by a cable which I received from Baba just a couple of months before his withdrawal from his playing, assuring me of his eternal love.